Hello, everyone. As the inaugural director of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto, I welcome you all to the second session of Iranian Diaspora Studies Seminar Series featuring Dr. Niyosha Keyzad, who will be speaking on Diasporic pilgrimage. The Diasporic Studies Seminar Series is a collaborative initiative of the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies at San Francisco State University, the Iranian and Persian Gulf Studies program at Oklahoma State University, and the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies. The series is co-convened with my colleagues, Professor Persis Karim of San Francisco State University and Amy Malek of Oklahoma State University. I am grateful to our co-conveners and their institutions for this significant initiative. I'm also grateful to our co-sponsors, the Canadian Society for Iranian and Persian Studies, the Iranian Studies Student Forum, and Roshan Cultural Heritage Foundation, which has generously supported the establishment of the Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. Before introducing Dr. Keyzad, I would like to express our personal and collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies operates. For thousands of years, it has been the homeland of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to serve as a home for many Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, learn, and teach on their ancestral homeland. My colleague, Professor Persis Karim, will introduce Dr. Keyzad, and Professor Amy Malek will moderate the session. Professor Karim.
Thank you, and thank you to both of my colleagues, Dr. Mohammed Tawakkoli Targhi and Dr. Amy Malek, for this wonderful initiative of this new series. As many of you know, the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies will be closing permanently in June due to the donors' request. So I'm really happy that some of the work that we've started will carry on in a new location and new form, and especially because it's in Canada, which is a much friendlier place. So thank you, Mohammed, for your kind introduction. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Niyosha Keyzad, who I get to say doctor because she recently defended her thesis. I think it was in February, and I had the pleasure of serving on her committee as an outside reader, and I was delighted by her work, both because it expands our notions of Iranian diaspora studies, Iranian diaspora literature, and women's literature all at the same time. Dr. Keyzad holds a PhD in English and Diaspora and Transnational Studies from the University of Toronto and an MA in English from McGill University. Her dissertation, Diasporic Pilgrimage, which is the subject of today's talk, Iranian Women's Return Narratives 1999 to 2020, examined post-revolution return writing through the lens of pilgrimage, focusing on how these narratives redefine diasporic return as a transformative experience for the returnee. Niyosha is a research associate currently at the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies and currently teaches critical writing at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. And I also want to say that Niyosha has taken up the new task of helping us organize for the conference that we are hosting next summer 2026 in Toronto, and thanks to the University of Toronto for leading this effort. So I think there will be a poster for that at some point. But in the meantime, I would like to welcome Dr. Keyzad and thank her for today's talk.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Professor Karim. I would also like to begin by thanking you all for taking the time this afternoon to be here to hear my talk that, as Professor Karim said, is based on my dissertation by the same title. I would like to just take a moment to thank my supervisors, Professors Mohammad Tabakuli, Neil Tankortanar, and Karina Vernon, and a special thanks to Professor Karim, who is my external reader. Uh, and also, that all of you have impacted my work in really fundamental ways. I also have to thank the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies for its support of my project. And now for my talk. Modern Iranian identity is defined by the pivot from the secularization of the state and society during the Pahlavi era to the Islamic sacralization of Iranian life after the revolution. Iran's move away from and toward the sacred is often imagined with respect to women's existence in Iranian public life and spaces, which figure prominently in diasporic women's life narratives. These texts emphasize how Iran has changed at the expense of women's rights and sense of belonging. For Iranian women writers abroad, post-revolution Iran is seen as an enigma that serves as the backdrop against which to represent and negotiate the diasporic self. The genre demonstrates a preoccupation with post-revolution Iran as a place that beckons the writers to return, not despite, but because of the ambivalence, difficulty, and restrictions imposed on women after the revolution. The circumstances of the 1979 revolution have shaped Iran's contemporary national ethos in ways that demand a reshaping of life writing to accommodate the unique expression of post-revolution nostalgia articulated by the nation's young but vast diaspora community. The revolution has given rise to unprecedented literary productivity, most evident in the emergence of a vibrant body of diasporic women's literature. In this talk, I will offer a background of the political origins, historical context, and critical scholarship surrounding this growing subgenre of Anglophone life writing. This project analyzes the subgenre through the paradigm of diasporic pilgrimage, which I see as a defining feature of Iranian women's return narratives that portray homecoming as an expression of acute identity crisis, pre-revolution nostalgia, and self-expression against the political and cultural forces that have shaped their hybrid subjectivity. Diasporic pilgrimage is a sacred journey that responds to the beckoning call of one's ancestral land, a process of working through nostalgia, exacerbated by the suddenness of the displacement and dispossession that define post-revolution diasporic existence. In my effort to historicize representations of diasporic pilgrimage in post-revolution Iranian women's life writing, I draw from scholarship in rhetoric, narratology, and religious studies to complicate the narrative of Iranian women's one-way escape out of Iran. In the context of diaspora, the hyphen between our national identities often reflect the global power relations that shape our diasporic trajectories, while reinforcing the idea that our ancestral homelands are places we come from, but not places we go to. To develop the concept of diasporic pilgrimage in the literature at hand, I draw from Svetlana Boyum's work on nostalgia and from Homi Bhabha's joint concepts of hybridity and third space, because they show that the desire for homecoming is a nostalgic reaction to a historically strained relationship between the two nations and cultures that make up one's identity. My conceptual framework comes into conversation with Boyum's paradigm of nostalgia, and more specifically her writing on post-revolution nostalgia, which is an elegia of the imagination that does not necessarily yearn for the previous regime or fallen empire, but that pines for what she describes as the, quote, unrealized dreams of the past and vision of the future that become obsolete, unquote, in the post-revolution era. A revolution creates divergent pre- and post-eras in a nation's history, and every revolution is a popular uprising until it is taken over by a new regime that overwrites a nation's existing ideology and ethos. This erasure of the past exacerbates nostalgia for dissidents of the post-revolution regime. Boehm further implies that incessant provocations between home and adopted nations, quote, contaminate post-revolution subjectivity and belonging. The aftershock of such upheaval reverberates for a long time for exiles. The regret of this event and its aftermath loom large in diasporic consciousness because of the sudden displacement and dispossession that define post-revolution diasporic existence. As Boyum suggests, revolutions further complicate diasporic identification by producing, quote, outbreaks of nostalgia that are, as she says, accompanied by political and cultural manifestations of longing, end quote, for the pre-revolution era, which seems more ideal in light of the extreme political shifts that shape a nation's post-revolution identity. In other words, for post-revolution diasporas, the process of identification tends to be interrupted by the political discourse between the ancestral and adopted homes. Among the prominent theories that conceptualize the diaspora experience, Homi Bhabha's theorization of hybridity offers a particularly useful departure from the binarism that permeates paradigms of diasporic identity. In the location of culture, Bhabha goes beyond systems of binary oppositions to approach hybridity as a process that creates an ambivalent, yet alternative and generative space of cultural production and reproduction. His third space, which Bhabha says is a characteristic of all language everywhere, is nonetheless particularly helpful in defining a discursive site or set of conditions in which transnational individuals can appropriate, translate, and negotiate cultural meaning using insider knowledge from the various sides of their hybrid existence to challenge dominant discourses in both home and adopted countries. Diasporic selves are more conscious of the third space than other people. In diasporic Iranian women's narratives of return, cultural interpretation enunciates the space created among the hybrid I, the Western you being the readers, and the Iranian native other, those who stayed put. Iranian women's narratives of return enunciate the self against the expectations of the Western readers because the authors depict a transience that is at times nationalist in its intense longing for the homeland, and at other times transnational in capturing a movement that evades the establishment of a stable identity in the homeland and in the diaspora in a critical way. Bhabha's concept of hybridity further speaks to a form of subversive authority that is enabled by the underlying ambivalence of third space, which turns the conditions of dominance into grounds for insight, intervention, transformation, and power. For the women writers under analysis, diasporic pilgrimage is an act of nostalgic third space making beyond diaspora and the post-revolution homeland, where the diasporic individual can enunciate their existence as undecided, not undecidable, which is to say, empowered by the ability to be neither here nor there, neither native nor diasporic, and always dynamic and transient. Iranian women's narratives of diasporic pilgrimage present the desire for homecoming as a nostalgic reaction to the historically strained relationship between Iran and the West. These narratives exploit depictions of Iranian women's hybrid gendered existence by rendering the ancestral homeland as a strange and mysterious place that is nonetheless a central point of reference for reimagining the South. My analysis has a twofold goal: to thematize depictions of diasporic pilgrimage in Iranian women's life writing in light of Iran's shifting image in the American eye. I include one text from the pre-9/11 era, Gelar Asayish Saffron Sky, published in 1999, and two published post-9/11, Marjan Satrapi's Persepolis 2, published in 2005, and Parnaz Forutan's Home is a Stranger, published in 2020, to demonstrate that representations of real and imagined sites of return in Iranian women's writing resonate with the trope of diasporic pilgrimage as a multi-temporal process of self-transformation that simultaneously mourns the loss and imagines the return of Iran's gilded pre-revolution era by narrativizing its physical remnants. Iranian women's diasporic pilgrimage narratives reflect an impulse to narrate sites of return to render the self legible because, for Iranian women, diasporic subjectivity and the desire for a better past and future are provoked by the unstable politics that shape the two sides of their hyphenated East-West gendered existence. The fixation on Iran's revolutionary changes through the lens of Western feminism has produced a considerable body of women's life writing in English that is laden with the tension between the personal seeing and the political being seen, and between speaking truth about systemic gender discrimination and the perpetuating of stereotypes of Iranians and Muslims through the Western gaze. With the exception of Firuza Dumas' comparatively depoliticized satirical life writing, Fani in Farsi, which is the only title that appears in official translation in Iran, and Laughing Without an Accent, the publication of Iranian women's life narratives is caught between the East-West cultural divide. Shireen Ebadi, the Iranian women's rights lawyer and Nobel laureate, is the only woman to publish her life narrative, Iran Awakening English from Iran rather than from the safety of the diaspora. Although largely ignored by literary critics, Ebadi's voice is notable, not only because of her wide influence and readership, but also because she so vividly portrays the physical threat women endure in everyday spaces of post-revolution Iran, which she sees as what she calls an obstacle course that women have learned to cope with. In her second narrative, Until We Are Free, which was written abroad, she is more critical and unreserved in describing Iran as, quote, one of the world's largest prisons, end quote, for dissidents of the regime, especially women. Diasporic Iranian women's life writing has largely been read in light of Ebadi's comment, but Fatemeh Keshavarz, Farzaneh Milani, and Sanaz Fatuhi have argued that narratives like Ebadi's reflect Iranian women's agency and progress after the revolution. In doing so, they are part of a broader discussion in Iranian and Middle Eastern studies to correct this Orientalist way of framing Iranian women's voices. Iranian women's narratives of return demonstrate a preoccupation with the revolution and 9/11 as defining moments in history for diasporic Iranian identification. Although there exists a modest body of pre-9/11 diasporic Iranian literature in English, it was not until 2 decades after the revolution and the mass emigration of Iranians that a distinct body of women's writing began to emerge abroad in response to shifting political discourse about post-revolution Iran. Nima Naqibi traces the onset of the Iranian women's memoir boom, which she argues began in earnest in 1999 with the publication of Gelare Asayesh Saffron Sky and Tara Bahrampour's To See and See Again. These books capture the ambivalence of early post-revolution diasporic Iranian subjectivity. But as I demonstrate in my first chapter, Asayesh renders a pre-9/11 conception of Iran that is elliptical and preoccupied with portraying the self rather than with writing the self into public discourse on Iran and women's role in society. For Babak Elahé, Azar Nafisi's 2003 text Reading Lolita in Tehran marks the inception of a new type of writing that, quote, confirms mainstream stereotypes about Iran while celebrating Western civilization, end quote, in the aftermath of 9/11. Scholars of Iranian diaspora studies mark 2001 as a turning point in the production of the life writing at hand toward the neo-Orientalist portrayal of Iranians, and they critique life narratives like Nafisi's Reading Lolita for reproducing stereotypes of Muslims and Iranians as backward and uncivilized terrorists. If Orientalism is a general Western European misrepresentation of the Orient, then Neo-Orientalism is the specifically American way of distorting the image of the Orient, particularly after the 1979 Revolution, Gulf Wars, and 9/11. In Covering Islam, published in 1981, Edward Said revises Orientalism in light of the Iranian Revolution and America's expanding cultural influence. He argues that America's media's incessant coverage of the revolution and hostage crisis mass-produced the image of Iranians as barbarians and of post-revolution Iran as a cautionary tale of a failed Islamic revolution. In his 2003 preface of the 25th anniversary edition of Orientalism, Said also reflects on Orientalism in a post-9/11 world and perhaps predicts what we are witnessing: the fast-paced media and electronic age drawing the Orient and its accompanying stereotypes closer to Americans, yet always through the othering gaze of the American eye. Diasporic Iranian women's life narratives appeared in 3 major waves that correspond to significant political outbreaks between Iran and America after the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran. They are the 1979 Revolution and American hostage crisis, the terrorist attacks of 9/11, and Bush's Axis of Evil State of the Union address, and the contentious 2009 Iranian presidential elections, or the Green Movement. While the bulk of this work is related to the revolution, the surge of publications came in the early 2000s in response to the rising demand for life writing, particularly political writing by expatriates of countries that Western media and political rhetoric labeled as malign rival nations. While a handful of life narratives were published between 1999 and 2003, the boom arguably occurred with the tens of titles published after 2003. The combined force of America's post 9/11 fallout with Iran, the publication of Nafis's controversial yet canonical book, and the American memoir boom were all conducive to the wave of Iranian women's life writing that has emerged in the Anglophone autobiography market. Diasporic Iranian literature is thus a Western and more specifically an American product. This subgenre, which has grown on the back of the unprecedented rise of nonfiction texts, serves the American Neo-Orientalist affinity for narratives of the oppressed female other, particularly stories that detail the burden of East-West diasporic existence for Iranian women. Before moving on, I want to establish diasporic pilgrimage as a critical framework for understanding narratives of return which stand out from other travel writing. The members of the diaspora who return to Iran feel themselves performing a pilgrimage to sacred sites. As a topic of scholarly interest, pilgrimage studies reached its peak in the 1990s. Oxford University even established the Pilgrimage Studies Network, which was active briefly between 2018 to 2020. Scholars have also pointed to the limitations of established definitions of pilgrimage and emphasized that, historically, pilgrimage and tourism have been intertwined, as everyday structures such as landmarks, streets, and paths have been used as cultural tools to negotiate the past and future to offer pilgrims a sense of stability and clarity. As Turner and Turner suggest, quote, every pilgrimage has a local and a regional history, responds more or less sensitively to a national history, and, especially in the cases of the most important pilgrimages, is shaped and colored by international, even world history, end quote. Benedict Anderson's landmark analysis of nations as imagined communities builds on Victor Turner's work to understand the way pilgrimage, or a trajectory followed by many, produces sites of overlapping identities to create linguistic, nationalistic, and cultural unity among those who convene there. He observes that the Hajj, which is the most important rite of passage for Muslims, foregrounds a common consciousness by connecting fellow pilgrims through the act and moment of pilgrimage. For Anderson, the, quote, strange physical juxtaposition of Malays, Persians, Indians, Berbers, and Turks in Mecca is something incomprehensible without an idea of their community in some form, end quote. That community is Islam. Anderson also argues, however, that in modern times, pilgrimage to secular equivalents in the career trajectories of people working for the state administration create an imagined community that is not religious, but has all the emotional identification of a religious identity. In this sense, pilgrimage to Mecca creates distinct imagined communities in each group as the passage leads those with a common national affiliation to reflect on their origins during their journey. In light of Anderson's reconsideration of the modern nation, it is possible to see how nationalism replaced religion in form and function. The movement of diasporic subjects across borders and between nations is yet another kind of pilgrimage. The notion of diasporic pilgrimage, which is also sometimes referred to as roots tourism, genealogy tourism, or diaspora tourism, is a useful point of departure for assessing the sacred element of homecoming. More recently, scholars have called for the deconstruction of the concept of pilgrimage as a critical framework for understanding the transformative features of traveling, especially with regard to ancestral tourism. Pilgrimage has many meanings ranging across religions and secular practices. As a noun which has been borrowed from the Latin pellegrinus and from the French pèlerin, the word pilgrim means stranger and alien. Whether sacred or secular, pilgrims occupy a liminal position because while they are familiar with venerated sites, they are usually foreign to the nation of pilgrimage. There is thus a fundamental tension between the foreign and the familiar in the concept of pilgrimage. This is especially the case for roots pilgrimage. In searching for signs of themselves and the physical remnants of the past, the diasporic returnee seeks spiritual unity with a now unfamiliar environment. First-hand experiences in the homeland allow the pilgrim to claim it as the physical manifestation of the hybrid self. despite being estranged from and a stranger in the ancestral land, the diasporic pilgrim travels to recognized sites, usually known through oral tradition, storytelling, public knowledge, and the media, but also through ancestral memories to collect experiences that are adopted into their memories of a place that they identify with but are foreign to. As a ritualized practice, pilgrimage is a participatory act of identification that emerges between individual and group identity. While religious pilgrimage is often portrayed as a group endeavor, as in, for instance, the Canterbury Tales, diasporic pilgrimage resonates with both pilgrimage and tourism because it is an individualistic practice that is shaped by one's personal aspirations, timeline, and itinerary, but that nonetheless draws on a sense of imagined collectivity. Even if a site of return is insignificant to others or is being visited for the first time, it is already significant for the writers through their imagined ties to it. Diasporic pilgrimage is based on a personal need for a sense of collectivity. In Rites of Return, Marianne Hirsch and Leo Spitzer suggest that diasporic return takes on, quote, characteristics of group pilgrimage, end quote, in that it is, quote, a journey addressing assumedly shared secular and spiritual desires, end quote. Unlike religious pilgrimage, which is a social endeavor that tunes the individual into a collective identity, diasporic pilgrimage is an individual expression of collective identity, of being there alone but together with other Iranians who are Iranians in relation to the land and each other. I refer to this movement as diasporic pilgrimage because the depictions of sacredness that emerge from narratives about genealogical travel transcend those associated with leisurely travel to present the returnee as a pilgrim searching for spiritual awakening and enlightenment through sacred sites of return. As I have discussed, diasporic pilgrimage is a unique kind of tourism that is motivated by the nostalgic desire for the era of national unity. But like religious pilgrimage, and unlike other forms of travel, the trip is neither leisure nor work because a pilgrim withdraws from their everyday life of work to make pilgrimage. The diasporic pilgrim returns in order to work through the historical rupture of diaspora. She thus takes on the exhausting task of traveling through a long itinerary to absorb the aura of a collective culture and all of these subtle characteristics that reflect her ancestral roots before the rupture of diaspora. Here I want to dwell on the important difference between making a pilgrimage and taking a trip or vacation, because while the former suggests labor, giving, work, the latter denotes leisure, taking, break. Today we associate the word travel with leisure, but it shares an etymology with the word travail or labor, which is borrowed from the French travailler to mean exerting oneself with hard work or performing a duty or service. In English, travail has fallen out of use beyond literary circles, but traveling and travailing only became distinct ideas in the modern period, and the OED's source text for the etymology of travail further demonstrates that, until recently, merchants and pilgrims were the only ones who traveled, and not for leisure. The earliest examples of life writing in English come in the form of Christian pilgrimage literature, such as Marjorie Kemp's The Book of Marjorie Kemp, published around 1400, and John Mandeville's The Travels of Sir John Mandeville, published around 1357 to 1371. Both Kemp and Mandeville write in great detail about their personal encounters with sacred sites and the evocation of the biblical memories attached to them. To borrow from Benedict Anderson, quote, in a pre-print age, the reality of the imagined religious community depended profoundly on countless ceaseless travels, end quote, by pilgrims. For centuries, Europeans used the Book of Sir John Mandeville as a guide through the Christian Holy Land, particularly for becoming acquainted with distant and unfamiliar yet symbolic places in the East. However, today's medieval scholars cannot decipher the names of certain places that the Mandeville author writes about, or confirm whether or not the places described in the book really existed, like a rock that he claims Jesus once sat on, and that also marks the dwelling place of Adam and Eve, in other words, the place of origin for him and his readership. Early pilgrimage narratives were extremely popular for a long time because they made distant places and memories relatable to Europeans by appropriating them into the master narrative of Christianity at a time when very few people had the means to take on the great travail of getting across sea and land, so those who made the journey often wrote about the rare and difficult experience. Pilgrimage is a rite of passage through which the followers of a given religion perform and imagine its promised future by traveling through a set itinerary of sacred land, which is the inaccessible object of desire. For me, however, Mandeville's compulsion to narrativize his experiences at known and obscure places, like the sacred rock, in granular detail is more important than distinguishing fact from fiction in his life writing. Writing the self into narratives of known places works to recast identity through sites of conflicting histories and memories authoritatively. Although the Mandeville author's elaborate narration of his encounters with sacred and possibly fictional places can be viewed as evidence of Christian propaganda and claim to land in the East, this mode of narration can also be seen as a revisionist endeavor that transcends religious authority in land by drawing from the accepted doctrine to write the self into stories of holy sites. This way of writing the self into narrative space emphasizes subjective experience and personal identification with symbolic locations, particularly those that signify layered and contesting historiographies. Pilgrimage is the earliest form of tourism, and often the most important trip people take throughout their lives, because the purpose of making pilgrimage is to transform the self by immersing the body and mind in sites that symbolize not only a specific faith, but also a collective desire for an idealized past that will reemerge to liberate the community. While the journey often entails physical and spiritual work, it is also a type of tourism that ends with the returnee's return home. Diasporic return combines elements of tourism and pilgrimage vis-a-vis the sacred and the secular to bridge the distance from the homeland. The circuitous movement of diasporic pilgrimage from, to, and from the homeland is an expedition that modifies one's diasporic trajectory and narrative. The journey is so important that it is often written into one's life narrative, and in the case of the text at hand, the self is written around this formative experience. Pilgrimage tourism has always been a demanding process because it entails days, weeks, or months of negotiating one's relationship to symbolic sites in faraway locations and regions that are central to one's identity. The journey is portrayed as a metaphysical detour that shifts one's subjectivity in ways that tourism does not. While a tourist who travels to see new things is detached from the sites of their itinerary by virtue of their novelty, the diasporic pilgrim is physically and spiritually connected to the landscape through first-hand or adopted memory. For instance, for diasporic individuals who have spent an extended period of time away from their place of origin, memories of the homeland play an even more prominent role in their sense of self. Diasporic individuals, especially those living in forced or voluntary exile, experience a nostalgia that renders it sacred by virtue of physical and temporal distance from the homeland. Motivated by the need to bridge distance and time, the diasporic returnee embarks on a mission to visit sites designated as sacred for rerouting their identity in the land that is shared with others who once lived or continue to live there. Unlike tourism, which seeks new experiences in new places, and like pilgrimage, which travels along the path of a collective past, diasporic pilgrimage is nostalgic in its palimpsestic perception of the homeland, which is viewed through signs of the past that exist underneath the present-day signs and functions of those places. For instance, in Home as a Stranger, Parnas's attempted self-repatriation to Iran and disillusionment there offers a rich example for understanding how diasporic pilgrimage detaches the author from the present day to preserve hope and optimism for a better future. Iranian women's expressions of post-revolution nostalgia present a utopian past that is projected onto a desired future, while the present day is repeatedly interrupted by hostile politics between Iran and America. The returnee's objective is to recover the collective past in the present in order to imagine a better future. So Parnas only sees what she wants to see because, as Boyum suggests, revolutions create a gilded aura that reflects nostalgia for a gilded past and the hope for its return in the future. A diasporic pilgrimage journey entails the traversal, embodiment, and internalization of the values embedded in certain time-stamped locations of personal and historical significance that must be experienced firsthand. In Islam, the term ziyarat refers to making the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca or other pious visitations to a sacred place, tomb, shrine, or person, such as elders and religious leaders. The Arabic term means to meet, to see, or to attend to elders and religious leaders out of respect and affection. Ziyarat, which is sacred in Iranian culture, captures the essence of diasporic pilgrimage because it recognizes the places and people that tie us to our ancestral roots as sacred. My understanding of diasporic pilgrimage thus combines the ritual of making pilgrimage or Hajj as a rite of passage to the most sacred site of one's lineage, the secular practice of visiting multiple sites that are deemed important in collective memory through oral history and the media, such as historical sites, shrines, and monuments, as well as the devotional act of ziyarat, visiting people and sites such as private land, homes, and gardens that are one's roots. In my second chapter on Marjan Satrapi's graphic life narrative, Persepolis 2, I analyze her development of a visual language that juxtaposes sacred sites, private and collective, in ways that foreground how her identity is reconstructed in the private spaces rather, that after the revolution become the arena for negotiating identity, status, and gender. Satrapi thus illustrates the potential for return to provide a path to healing and closure for the diasporic subject through family encounters and storytelling. As a phenomenon, diasporic return is a dynamic movement between 2 points of possibility for identification. It is also an act of mobility between 2 homes and therefore captures a sense of in-betweenness that is negotiated at locations of identity. The cultural studies critic Stuart Hall posits that the Afro-Caribbean experience of forced migration to the New World produced, quote, a certain imaginary plentitude, end quote, that recreates an endless nostalgia for, quote, lost origins, to be one again with the mother, to go back to the beginning, end quote. For Hall, the diasporic return of the African diaspora can only be fulfilled on the level of the imagination, but the perpetual desire to go back to the beginning indicates a point of origin that is nonetheless sacred because it is shared with an imagined community link through geography. Diasporic pilgrimage is the result of pent-up nostalgia, first-hand and adopted. The journey thus reflects the diasporic desire to return to originary sites of nostalgia and collective memory to negotiate identity in one's other home, as well as the touristic urge to gain perspective on the self by relocating to another place of identity that is neither native nor diasporic space. Avtar Bra's concept of diaspora space emerges at the intersection of time and space and of native and diasporic. Bra defines diaspora space as a site of intersecting trajectories and identities shaped by both historical and contemporary movements. She states, quote, diaspora space is the point at which boundaries of inclusion and exclusion, of belonging and otherness, and of us and them are constructed and reconfigured. It is inhabited not only by those who have migrated and their descendants, but equally by those who are constructed and represented as indigenous, end quote. Bra's term points to the physical dispersion of people as well as to the cultural, social, and political intersections that shape identities and experiences across geographies and temporalities. She asserts that diaspora space is, quote, the site where the native is as much a diasporian as the diasporian is the native, end quote, indicating a mutual constitution of identities within this space that is, as she says, inhabited not only by those who have migrated, but equally by those who are constructed and represented as indigenous. Diaspora space is the realm wherein power relations can be negotiated and reconfigured to produce new cultural forms and social relations. Diasporic Iranian life writing draws heavily on the Edenic image of pre-revolution Iran by narrativizing spatiality to depict a past and future that is untainted by the present moment of history. Many writers like Asayish depict an imaginative return to old homes and plots of land, especially those that their families have been dispossessed of. The emblematic symbol of the native tree and the ancestral garden are used repeatedly to create a sense of continuity through generations to reimagine the future. And while the vision they inspire is often melancholic, these sites of return offer clarity about their identity and historical position. Like pious pilgrims, diasporic pilgrims want to transform themselves by traveling to faraway places to witness the evidence of a better past and future, which serve as the background for portraying their progress throughout the narrative. Diasporic pilgrimage writing exploits the narrativization of space-time to develop the author's subject with reference to the material world and history of the homeland. Hamid Nafisi's pioneering work on diasporic Iranian cinema is useful for understanding the importance of sites of return in life writing. Nafisi posits that one type initial media response to the rupture of the displacement is to create a utopian prelapsarian chronotope of the homeland that is uncontaminated by contemporary facts. This is primarily expressed in the homeland's open chronotopes, its nature, landscapes, landmarks, and ancient monuments, and in certain privileged renditions of house and home, end quote. Nafisi's notion of open chronotopes draws on Mikhail Bakhtin's chronotope to address the centrality of space-time in the post-revolution diasporic Iranian imaginary because it is so saturated in nostalgia for Iran's pre-revolution days. The affinity for Iran's bygone era is manifest in frequent projections of the past, in the narrativization of symbolic sites of return that are spatially textured, or thick, as Bakhtin would say. The essence of Bakhtin's call for a paradigm shift toward reading space-time as intrinsically connected elements of narration becomes clear in the off-quoted passage. He says, in the literary artistic chronotope, spatial and temporal indicators are fused into one carefully thought out concrete world. Time, as it were, thickens, takes on flesh, becomes artistically visible. Likewise, space becomes charged and responsive to the movements of time, plot, and history, end quote. Chronotopic narration is rendered through points in the geography of a community where time and space intersect and fuse. There is thus an intrinsic connectedness of temporal and spatial relationships that tie people to places across time, hence geography of a community. I am arguing that there is a particular chronotope shared by all the writers of the Iranian diaspora. There is also a convergence between Bakhtin's notion of the chronotope in fiction and his influential work on the Bildungsroman. In keeping with his earlier work on the function of spatiotemporality in narrative, he extends his ideas to address historical life writing and the geographical dimensions of human experience, individual and collective. In the Bildungsroman and its significance in the history of realism, Bakhtin argues that the protagonist of a Bildungsroman, which he describes as, quote, the image of man in the process of becoming, end quote, must grow alongside major changes in their surrounding historical world. Bakhtin's conceptualization of the Bildungsroman overlaps with his dialogical understanding of chronotopic narration, which suggests that chronological markings on space become visible through a cognitive mapping of the passage of time in order to position the subject in history through temporal imprints that are used as timestamps on the material environment of a text. Although Bakhtin's analysis is limited to representations of the space-time continuum in the novel, the relative underdevelopment of the chronotope with respect to other literary tropes allows us to leverage the theoretical openness of this concept and apply it to other forms and modes of narration, particularly nonfiction narratives that are anchored in what he calls the concrete world of history. It is also significant to note that Bakhtin's theory is derived from his analysis of the travel novel of ordeal, and biographical fiction, thus offering a useful framework for analyzing the return narratives in question as autobiographical travel narratives. Returning to Nafisi's point that the diasporic Iranian imagination produces a prelapsarian chronotope, it can be said that diasporic return renders a utopian chronotope in an attempt to bridge the temporal divide that is created by major historical shifts which break up communities and create the notion that the individual exists outside of their community. Revisiting Boehm's conceptualization of modern nostalgia as an expression of diasporic spiritual longing is fitting here. She says, modern nostalgia is a mourning for the impossibility of mythical return, for the loss of an enchanted world with clear borders and values. It could be a secular expression of a spiritual longing, a nostalgia for an absolute, a home that is both physical and spiritual, the Edenic unity of time and space before entry into history. Boehm is discussing nostalgia for communist Europe after the perestroika. Popular uprisings like the Russian, Cuban, and Iranian revolutions overturned the national ethos of those nations in ways that broke with the past to bring radical changes that haunt the diaspora for many years after the fact. While mourning the passage of time is symptomatic of modern nostalgia in general, revolutions and wars create a different sense of time and regret about a post-era, post-revolution, post-war, and bifurcate a period of history into before and after so that a single event becomes the focus of nostalgic anguish. Although the event that triggers diasporic movement may be different for each family and individual, all diasporic individuals are bound by the major historical event that uprooted the community in its aftermath. Diasporic Iranian women's life writing continuously retells and returns to the revolution because it is a historical moment that women regret and need to reckon with. The abrogation of women's rights looms large in their prelapsarian chronotope because the revolution marks a moment of loss for women in ways that continue to disrupt their process of diasporic identification in the West, where they feel further divided by their gendered experience of migration. Nostalgia, which, as Boyum asserts, already has a proclivity to misremember the past, is further complicated by revolutions and other extreme political conditions that exacerbate the longing for what she refers to as a gilded past. Extreme political circumstances that disrupt the historical narrative of a nation lead the nostalgic to imagine what she refers to as phantom homeland, that is based on a mix of memories and fantasies of a dangerously divisive and misremembered place, hence phantom, that the nostalgic obsesses over. These extreme turns of history give way to an intense restorative nostalgia, which is the dangerous tendency of nostalgia to unreflectively fixate on fragmented memories that reconstruct an idealized past. For Boyum, the revolution itself gives the pre-revolution regime, ancien regime, and history its shape, as well as, quote, the sense of closure and a gilded aura that diasporic individuals long for. Iranian women writers mourn their physical displacement and temporal irreversibility more intensely because their nostalgia is an expression of longing for a place that is imagined retrospectively in light of recent history. Sites of post-revolution nostalgia become relics and sacred objects of a time when gendered equity was a major national ideal in Iran. Iranian women express a sense of nostalgia for the pre-revolution national ethos that govern the spaces that now represent the collapse of the previous order, including the Pahlavi's promulgation of various laws in favor of women's rights. Iran is a site of nostalgia for the progressive women's rights that ended with the revolution, but the nostalgic narrativization of sites that commemorate women's loss of space also entails imagining a future that reflects the past. Diasporic pilgrimage is detached from the present because its main objective is to exploit time to retreat, immerse, and have as many revelatory experiences as possible in the homeland. For Boyum, nostalgia has two modes of thought: reflective nostalgia and restorative nostalgia. Although diasporic pilgrimage is a gesture of return, it is not a restorative effort, in other words, reverse diaspora. Diasporic pilgrimage is an expression of what she calls reflective nostalgia that dwells on algia, the pain of longing, and is keenly aware of the passage of time, rather than a symptom of restorative nostalgia, which, quote, takes itself dead seriously, end quote, about the duty to return to and to rebuild the homeland. With the exception of Satrapi's Persepolis II, which is one of extended pilgrimage and arguably one of return, as she lives in Iran for many years, goes to school there, and even gets married and divorced before returning to the diaspora. The other writers are conscious of their limited time in Iran. Kemal el-Soleili refers to this insatiable appetite for first-hand experiences in the homeland as, quote, a case of FOMO, fear of missing out, end quote. As discussed with reference to Parnas's diasporic FOMO, the returnee is extremely preoccupied with time because it seems to move more quickly in the homeland where there is much to do in a limited amount of time. The 1 and 1.5 generation who have first-hand memories of Iran find pilgrimage more overwhelming because the difficulty of navigating the homeland in the aftermath of revolutionary changes and is incessantly misrecognizing places make it seem like more time has passed. In contrast to Gelare, who returns again and again to resolve her sense of melancholy, Parnas's diasporic pilgrimage is a journey of self-discovery through adventure, because while she is a 1.5er, she demonstrates a sense of female defiance that makes her an outlier among the narrators. Compared to Gelare, she has a great time in Iran, where she even gains a sense of confidence and feminine prowess by pushing the boundaries of gender segregation laws and traditions. As I discussed in the last chapter of my dissertation, Parnas actually exploits the dangers of being a woman in Iran in ways that liberate her. Baba's concept of undecidability, which serves as the backdrop of hybridity, refers to the act of subverting dominant discourse to give voice to those other denied knowledges and cultural expressions that are suppressed by dominant powers. Baba is discussing the experience of colonization, but what he says applies to diasporic experience as well. Therefore, the tension between the parts of one's identity is integral to hybrid existence. It is this unbearable, deconstructed symbol and its irreconcilable cultural contestation that marks the hybrid itself, rather. For Baba, hybridity, quote, is not a third term that resolves tensions between two cultures in a dialectical play of recognition, but rather a process of acknowledging the convergence of collective and personal histories in identity. Hybridity reveals itself through a double voice of repression, native and authority, colonial. As I argue with reference to Persepolis 2, specifically Margie's perspective shifts between Eastern and Western ways of seeing the other and seeing herself as the other. The inherent tensions of hybrid identification with the homeland lead to productive identity and moments of coming of age for hybrid individuals who learn the diasporic language of enunciating the self. As stated earlier, being on diasporic pilgrimage is to occupy a subject position between native and diasporic through movement and geographical relocation, which shifts the diasporic individual's sense of displacement, as in the source of tension, from diaspora to homeland. While the writers at hand are ambivalent about their identity before returning to Iran, they all achieve some form of closure from the journey at hand at the end of their narratives, because diasporic pilgrimage works to demystify the homeland and perceived notion of difference between native and diasporic identities. Regardless of generational and physical distance from the homeland, the desire for diasporic homecoming is based on the belief that embodying sites of return, as in locations of personal, ancestral, and historical import, will result in a kind of transformation and rerootedness that one can only attain in their homeland as the most sacred place for the diasporic individual sense of self. I use the word sacred because while diasporic consciousness sees the adopted land and its central dwelling place and place of material comfort, it always looks back to the ancestral land as its spiritual abode. Like pilgrimage, diasporic return is a project of personal and spiritual reorientation. Within the paradigm of diasporic identity, the pilgrim resists losing touch with her diasporic roots and even establishes new connections to places that are otherwise insignificant to their parents or those who stayed put. These texts extend our understanding of pilgrimage as a way of narrating the self through the back and forth movement between the homeland and adopted nations when they are politically and ideologically polarized. The idea of diasporic pilgrimage is novel in that it gets at the heart of the relentless longing to belong vis-à-vis the nostalgic sentiments and hostile politics that compel diasporic individuals to relocate and return to their ancestral homeland, despite how much it may have changed or remained the same since their last departure. The lack of historical and ontological continuity, particularly with the social shifts of a revolution and its ensuing history, fuels their diasporic affinity to return repeatedly to sites where the self can be reimagined with the possibility of a different future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Keyzad. So wonderful to hear this talk. I want to open the floor to questions. The way we'll do this is we'll have If you have a question, please use the raise hand function in Zoom, and I will call on you so that you can ask your question for us rather than have you type it in or something like that. If you do prefer to type it in, I can see the chat, but we'd rather hear from you. So please, if anyone has a question, please raise your hand. Susan, please.
Hi, thank you so much. That was amazing and really comprehensive. Based on your research and your studies and your finalizing this presentation, what could you share with us about the personal stressors that coincide with the structure and the revolution and the historical aspects of what's happened to the Iranian women and how it affects us today, even in the United States? Was there something that surprised you? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan, for your question and taking the time to listen. I think perhaps you're referring to sort of, I think you said personal stressors, sort of maybe common themes and issues that come up, and it's interesting you mentioned it before we sort of started the session. We were talking about this too. What I notice coming up in a lot of the narratives, and I'm especially thinking about Asayish's, but it seems to be that the impetus for returning, and I would be grateful to know what others, Professors Malik and Karim and others have to say. But a lot of times it tends to be getting papers. And like Asayesh waits many years to get her green card, and that seems to be the reason why she returns to. Also, another element of the memoir boom is that the relative era of moderate politics before Ahmadinejad, that also came up a lot. I hope that answers the question, if that's maybe what you were thinking of. I'd be happy if you have follow-up questions.
My only other thing is, it's kind of in the same vein, is being that you're from Iran and doing this, was there anything poignant that came across to you in terms of like your closeness to the subject matter?
For sure, I think it is definitely, I think PhD projects tend to be personal in some way or another, but what you said, I think what I was struck by most was this intense sort of feeling in passages where the narrators go on at great length to describe being there, what it felt like for them. It just really seemed like the preoccupation, and that was really striking for me. Because in life writing also, I think we're always sort of trying to strike a balance between sort of giving what's factually there and then the rest of it, which is narrativization. So, but also I think this is sort of what gives the narratives life. And I think for a lot of us, I think for a lot, the readers are not just the Western readers, right? I think the readers are also the diasporic readers. And I think for a lot of us, we do get to read and live through Iran, just like the earlier pilgrimage text that I was talking about, because we don't go or haven't gone. And are just, I think we're all of us share this chronotope, as I said, because we want to, yeah, read about Iran, read about its spaces, its corners, sort of in the minute details.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Persian.
This is something that I noticed when reading your dissertation, is because of the time frame that you're focusing on up until 2020. And I wonder if you've seen anything since then. I know that like people haven't traveled very much to Iran, both because of COVID and also because of the regularized policy of people who are dual nationals being in some peril of being imprisoned. But I wonder if you can extend the question of diasporic nostalgia even to the politics of how people are looking at Iran today, which seemed really evident during the women life freedom movement. This kind of idea of, you know, the crown prince being the better choice to replace in the very context of woman life freedom. And so I'm wondering, how do we think about your work in conversation with more recent events that are not necessarily expressed in the literary, but seem to be expressed in the political?
Thank you for this thoughtful question, and it's one I think about often. And again, what stood out and what is striking in the women's return narratives is that there is this reaction in publication. So I'm looking forward to reading texts written in the post Trump, post women life freedom era, because it seems that every historical event that makes travel to Iran more inaccessible, more of an ordeal, perhaps more dangerous, does create a curiosity in the diaspora and among readers to hear about women who go back. And um, so I think in that sense, I'm looking forward to reading more. But I think we can see what we sort of foresee what will be the topic, what will be talked about when we do see these narratives, um, which will be, I think, what is really really important. And what I think I really admire about the women life freedom movement is that I think something has really shifted in our conception of Iranian women, um, and since the women life freedom movement, that I think for a while, when we were going into the defense, I thought about having, an image because and slides, because I was so struck by the image of and the video of that young woman who took off her clothes on the university campus in response to being harassed. So I think these events really make the body so visible in the public spaces of Iran, the ways that women are conscious of it, use it to um, express themselves and their position.
I see two
I hope,
hands.
yeah,
Sorry.
I hope we see more fiction as well. I think that would be really, I know we've talked about this, and that's also something I'm looking forward to reading, but sorry, go ahead.
No, not at all. I think you're right. We've seen a lot more fiction than life writing lately, maybe as a result of less travel, but also because of the shift in the industry, the publishing industry, right? What's allowed to be published. Anyway, not to insert my own thoughts. Please, Leila Maslami, you are next.
Thank you, Niyosha John, for the illuminating talk. It was a very well-researched thesis, actually. And my question is that, what was your experience working with Marjan Satrabi's book, particularly in terms of the visual elements compared to other books that you were actually you were doing the research? And did you notice the differences while you were trying to translate the third space through the work?
Thank you, Leila John, for your question and for listening. I'm so glad you asked that because including Satrapi's Persepolis was in some ways it created a challenge, but also was a really excellent way of looking exactly for the third space in it. And one way that it came out, and maybe others felt this way too, or kind of stood out, were, of course, with the images. And sometimes there are speech bubbles that are in Persian, that really create a different place that I would sort of dwell on those a lot and wonder who they were speaking to, who they were writing to. Um, uh, but I, but it was the way that the way that she, in those moments, she sort of looks back at at us, the reader. That was the most striking way that I think she shows how conscious she is of herself. There are moments where she kind of breaks the fourth wall, we would call it in cinema, and there's even an instance where her father looks at us when she goes back, and that is really striking because there are these moments where the narrative gets really sort of intense. And those are the moments when she makes eye contact, and then other parts where I said so there's a lot of opportunity there to look at to look for these spaces, but I really enjoyed working with the text, and yeah, I hope that addressed it.
Gita Hashimi, please.
Thank you, Niyosha John. I really enjoyed your the conversation, informal conversation after the session last week that we had about these diasporic spaces, and also your presentation today, which was opened up a bunch of spaces for me to think through. I'm thinking out loud here, and I know that your focus is on specifically on published fiction books or published life writing book, or things that fall in between. But I'm also wondering, I'm thinking more about like the work that, for example, Shahzad Mojabi is doing with women political prisoners, and the kind of life writing that they are doing, which does not fall into this kind of industry, conventional industry-oriented publishing world. I'm wondering if you see in that kind of work those elements of diasporic nostalgia that you see in these, in the works that have already been published and are in circulation. If you see in there, you mentioned several elements of this diasporic nostalgia, if you see any of that in that kind of work. Thank you. And I'm also thinking that whether that work, the work that's, for example, being done by political prisoners, if it's that, as a person who's from that generation, I can definitely see the generational distance between that work and what comes later by writers that you mentioned and others. I wondered if you could comment on that generational distance. Thank you.
Can I just ask to reiterate the last part about generational distance?
Well, there is so I'm going to personalize here because I don't have specific examples in my mind to talk about right now other than my own work. And I'm thinking that, I've been particularly keen on fighting back the nostalgic tendency in my work. And I know other artists of my generation who've also, who were in Iran and who did, leave Iran after the 1979 revolution, that have consciously been fighting that tendency. Also partly because they wanted to resist the stereotyping and, the bigger political push to present, to place Iranian women in a specific box. So I know that we haven't been working, the frame of reference hasn't been nostalgia. Rather, the frame of reference has been the kind of active spaces that that we as a generation created, and the kind of active spaces that we are creating here in the diaspora to fight back both against the dominant authoritarian regime in Iran and also against those dominant frames here. And in this work, I see a generation, I see a distance between my generation and the younger generation who's more adept at publishing and presenting work in mainstream spaces, whose work you talked about, and I think the publications that you talked about mostly fall in the second category, in generation, did you say 1.5ers?
Exactly. Most of them leave
Right? Yeah.
Iran. Most of them leave Iran as children, sort of between.
Exactly. But there are those of us who left Iran, who were active in Iran and who left Iran as adults and who now live in diaspora and have never returned, like myself, right? And I know others who haven't done that return pilgrimage. So I'm thinking about, whether you see, elements of nostalgia in that kind of work. Thank you.
So much, Kitajan. And you're referring to prison narratives when you refer to that kind of work. So initially, I was going to include prison narratives in the project that was much more broad in its scope, and it eventually became it narrowed down to narratives of homecoming because and I see them as the only narratives that complicate exactly as I said, the narrative of the danger surrounding Iran. And when you look, there are many prison memoirs. I would say that that's another important subgenre. Marina Nemat's A Prisoner of Tehran, Jason Rezaian, Roxana Saberi. There are quite a few narratives written by even second generation returnees who go to prison and spend a long time there. And those do as well have a different, in other words, I did also think about these through the framework of nostalgia, because it is also that their journey is, the homeland is so sacred that they have taken on the task of returning, and they too narrativize spaces sort of compulsively, but because the sort of the event of the narrative being the imprisonment, that tends to be the bulk of the narrative. The other thing to remember, that I am always reminded of, is that once the text is written and published, it sort of seals the exile, in that as long as it hasn't been published, maybe there is still a window to go back. But there was another part of my of the dissertation, and specifically the introduction and other parts, where I get into more detail about first generation, and then Rupert Rumbot. He is a sociologist, and he comes up with this idea, and he really then starts to refine it. He talks about 1.25, 1.75, and so on. But he essentially, the way he really, when you get at the core of what he's arguing, it's that he kind of says where your identity is formed. And that is, I think, dependent for, satrapy actually leaves in a little bit later, in sort of pre-teens. So in some ways, her identity is more formed. It's more individualistic, but I think in the way that it is not, it's reflective of the history that was experienced by the generation. I think that's something that Rumbot that kind of misses, rather than sort of just as sort of thinking of it as just developmental phases, more about the history that was witnessed, I think, does change as you said, the sense of nostalgia, the complicated sense of nostalgia.
Abulfaz and then Negar.
Thank you, Niyosha, for a wonderful talk. I have to read your dissertation, definitely. I was just comparing it with memoirs that Cuban woman wrote in America in Diaspora. And there are a lot of similarities, although what Iranian women went through was completely different experience. I wanted to know your opinion. You talked about nostalgia and different kind of nostalgia, and when I read some of the Cuban women's diasporic writings and novels, there is a sense of sometimes they talk about it consciously. There is a sense of a utopian nostalgia or an imagined nostalgia, a great Cuba that existed before the revolution, which historically doesn't match the reality. And I wanted to see whether that is also reflected in some of these nostalgic writings of Iranian women, and how to deal with that as a reader well, our generation hasn't seen the pre-revolution, but people who witnessed the pre-revolution time, how one can imagine and deal with that kind of reflection.
Thank you, Abulfaz. This is a really good question because, as you said, post-revolution nostalgia is really selective. It tends towards the utopian, as Nafisi also argues. Actually, sort of going back a little bit to Gita's question, in the third chapter on Furutan's Home as a Stranger, her mother and father do not agree. I believe her, and also I think Tara Bahrampur, there's a lot of tension between the mother and father, whether or not they should make the return. So it's in those moments it becomes so important to see how the post memory of the first generation impacts how the generation, the returnee sees Iran. And in several of the texts, there's like an explicit statement where the returnee says, I need to go and see it for myself. And I think this is precisely where it becomes the question of, but why do you have to go back? Especially now in when we have so much social media and Google and articles and so much information and pictures and geotags and so on, because of this sense that you have to go and physically be there to work through the conflicting narratives, but also the memories of your parents. They aren't even consistent, because going back to Gita John's question, their memories of the revolution are so conflicting. You know, members of the same family, depending on their political allegiance, religion, and so on. Even their intellectual position, will have had very different memories of the same events that they pass on then to the next generations who have to work through it. I think that's a part of it. You have to then work through these inherited memories.
Thank you.
Can I ask for your thoughts on the Cuba side of that question, or any other kinds of comparatives that you've had a chance to do, or maybe while you're focused on the dissertation, you haven't yet been able to go that way, but there's so many interesting comparisons that I think we could look for. And so I'm curious if you have any.
For sure. I think I thought a lot about the Russian Revolution, because when its 100th year anniversary passed, it was kind of a time to look back and see sort of what has become of it. And it was also interesting to see how that is memorialized, how it's been shown as this terrifying event that happened, but also romanticized. And that it was this romantic moment that, revolutions are only revolutions until somebody comes and speaks for them. So I think those moments are when you often hear from the generation that experience revolutions, they talk about those moments, those few days when everybody was in the streets and it was sort of a people's revolt, a people's revolution. That is really interesting. But I think revolutions never work. Like they're not a great they can't be sustained, and not that they, of course, they're just not a great answer, and they always seem to, like an elastic, sort of slash back. So I think I've thought about that, and but also that because of that change, it really, not to reiterate, but it says that creates a sense of a false past. The romanticization of all revolutions seems to be is the most interesting element in these texts, exactly as I think Persistron mentioned, that sometimes the discussions in the diaspora as to where the nation should go seems to be very detached from the experiences of those who stayed put, and much more attached to the memories of a gilded past. Yeah.
Negar, what's next?
Niyosha, thank you so much for this comprehensive research and the amazing talk. I know that you mostly focused and looked through this diaspora society from inside, but my question is about the outside of this society. I was wondering, through your research, did you find any example of institutions or organizations, especially cultural institutions or organizations, that had like a ongoing programs for this second or generation immigrants, and to help them ease this progress of adaptation to the society, and they have this like intentional program to target this group specifically to help them through this progress.
Thank you, Negajan, for being here, and your question, which, just to reiterate, you're wondering about if I came across sort of cultural institutions that help the Iranian diaspora with resettlement. There are really great institutions in the city that I can think of, Trillium, for example, that offer settlement services and sort of community spaces for Iranians. But I think of diaspora space often, and it's wonderful. Toronto as a diasporic Iranian city, I think, has changed so much in the last few years, and I'm really sort of plug in here, shameless plug in for the conference. I'm really, really glad that the conference is taking place here, because I think Toronto has changed a lot in the last decade, even since the pandemic. We know there are a lot more Iranians immigrating here, and with that, I'm thinking back to Paris's presentation too, but the city has changed, Tehranto has changed, the plazas have changed. Those are all diaspora spaces that I think really make settlement here so much easier. That we have multiple stores, multiple publications, newspapers, and restaurants all the way along Yonge Street, I think, and so and then also representatives. I think having more representatives in politics also shows is that folks can write to, and folks vote for, who can have these important conversations around tables that might really make a difference in people's status of being able to go back and so on.
But Yushajan, what about the non-Iranian groups or non-Iranian institutions or organizations?
Non-Iranian institutions who help non-Iranians or for Iranians?
For Iranian.
I would have to think about that more. I can't, unfortunately, think of non-Iranian institutions that are targeting Iranian communities for, but maybe we can chat more about it. I can't think of one right now. I'd be happy to know if others of know some doing that work.
Welcome centers, but I haven't been to one in a while that would target Iranians through Persian language classes for English, teaching English to Iranians and things like that. But anyway, I'll leave that for experts to go to. I will take this opportunity to ask some of my own questions, if that's okay. Thank you for this presentation. It's very interesting. I can't wait to read the dissertation and hopefully the book that comes from it. My question has to do with the selection of these three texts. I'd be very curious to hear what texts you weren't able to include. I know when we're writing our dissertations, we often have to narrow, and so some things get left out. And so I asked that for a couple of reasons. One is that you kind of make the case that life writing in the Iranian diaspora, especially among women, has become kind of an American genre that has to do with that post 9/11 moment, that has to do with the kind of memoir boom happening in the US in general. But one of your three cases is French, right? And we see life writing from Iranian women in Sweden and in Canada and in lots of other countries as well. So I'm curious about your kind of selection of texts, and also this idea of that, but this being a very American kind of format. And then kind of connected to that, can you give us a sense for within the Iranian women, diasporic women life writing kind of corner of memoir, how many of these are return narratives, right? How many of these are focused specifically on that return compared to more general or other types of life writing in that field?
Thank you so much, Amy Jen. The last question was how many in general are return narratives?
I mean, you don't have to give us a count, but do you have a sense for, like, is this a small piece of Iranian diaspora women's memoir writing, or is this becoming a larger trend where more and more are writing about return, or maybe less and less are writing about return for some of the reasons you mentioned?
Thank you so much. This is a really important question that I've been asked, that I've thought about. That statement in the talk where I say that it's an American product. It is kind of a statement that is meant to have this sort of impact. But I've thought about it a lot, and I wanted to change it a lot because of the questions that it raises. And I think, well, I want to talk about satrapy for a second, because the book is in its original French publication and its English exactly the same. When you read them, it doesn't change any of the language, the words are exactly the same. But they're very different narratives still, because of course the original French is much more sort of an avant-garde, not non-mainstream. It's sort of in its 4 volumes with different covers that idealize a completely different history. And in that way, I think the text Persepolis is a really excellent example of a case study of how the same text, exactly the same text, is marketed and packaged and framed so differently. Because I think that while it is a French text, and it was originally published in French, and it's very important for French readers, children. It's very canonical in France. Most children you speak to have read Persepolis in school, which is both delightful and interesting, because in speaking to them, you quickly realize that they are much more interested in the text because of the fixation on the hijab and covering. That seems to be much more of interest when it comes to Persepolis than the other elements of the narrative that are highlighted for an American audience. And then I think it became also much more difficult to think about Canadian, Australian, and American when American publishers have so much absorbed smaller publishers. The reason I really liked working with Asayish, for example, is that she is published by a smaller publisher. And as I said, Satrapy I included because I wanted to work with the visual element, and I wanted to look at a text that, even though the memories and the text, the narrative is much earlier like the others, and while I don't want to put too much stress on the preface, but the preface of Persepolis, she says, I'm writing this to, she says something to the along the lines of like, I'm going to correct this image that is recently circulating. So that again, it goes back to sort of how it's packaged. And so I think while definitely it's very important, and I would like maybe a future project to look at the really important differences between different global Iranian diaspora texts that, differentiate between the American, Canadian, Australian, European. I think also it's really important to remember and be conscious that in various ways, all of these texts seem to be speaking to the American eye, or framing it. The lens seems to be, what does the American public, the large Anglophone public want to read? So I always wanted to keep that, and that's why I ultimately decided to keep that statement as a recognition of this immense power that American publishers have on the image of Iranian diaspora, on producing like what the Iranian diaspora means the world over. I think it's very much defined by Americans.
Dr. Tavakoli had a question.
Thank you very much. Dr. Keyzad, thank you for your wonderful presentation. I look forward to the publication of your book. And the question that I have, reflecting on Nafisi's reconstruction of the concept chronotopia, and much of these return journeys are a return to an ideal past of some sort, often in narratives of pilgrimage. The return is subjective, and the nostalgia is subjective, personal, psychological. But because of the time framing of your project, much of this return, rather than enabling us to recover the personal, the subjective, the psychological need for the return, it becomes a political utopia, or it becomes a political manifesto of some sort. I'm wondering if you had included in this exploration return narratives that predated the revolution, or a narrative that was not subsumed by the revolution, whether you could tap into this sort of subjective return. Because a lot of people who return, they want to go to their old home, to their garden, as you noted, and a lot of these highly personal sites of memory. But much of this gets lost over this master narrative of revolution, master narrative of 9/11 and all that. How can you recover from this overwhelming power of the revolution to tap and recover part of that personal drive that gets people to go back home?
Thank you very much, Ustad Tawakoli. So the thing about earlier narratives is that, again, to reiterate a little bit of what I said earlier, is that on the one hand, the Iranian diaspora, pre-revolution diaspora, was a very small community. In America, in Canada, it was in like the hundreds, very small. So the other part of it is that before the revolution and the hostage crisis, there was not as much interest in these texts. I think that's one of the reasons we don't have a lot of publications written before. There is one text I am thinking of. You can just give me a moment. I think, yes, Nahid Rashlin's Foreigner is published just sort of at the wake of the revolution. And those are, I think they're sort of it's an autobiographical fiction. And it is really interesting when you read these texts, in the way that Iran is. What I noted was, even with Bahrampur, despite that they're both published in 99, well after the revolution, even they seem to describe Iran in different terms, in different ways. And this is why I thought that it is important to think about 9/11 as changing this language. It seems to be that these earlier texts describe Iran in more Orientalist terms than Neo-Orientalist terms, um, even describing Iran as Persia, or um, the reference to Islam. They tend to be much more um, Orientalist than Neo-Orientalist. But in another way, what's really interesting is that, exactly as Said says, the later texts, the Neo-Orientalist, sort of the ones that are, we can say maybe lean towards that representation, or have been seen that way, they seem much more familiar with Iran than the earlier texts. And that, I think, exactly contributes to the Orientalizing versus Neo-Orientalizing, because Neo-Orientalism, as Said says, it pretends to be, or it claims to be much more familiar with the Orient, despite having had shorter historical overlap and exchange.
Just as a follow-up, recently, I cannot remember the title of the book. Recently, going beyond travel logs, this scholar, whose name I cannot remember, tapped into a lot of letters that were written, unpublished letters of journeys to various places, which has really expanded the whole travel literature that is limited to published travel literature. I'm wondering, in this particular case, if you could tap into letters, memoirs written but not published, that does not have this political-topic or master political narrative embedded in it, whether that could enable you, or maybe a different strategy would be to go for a micro reading that puts aside the master political narratives, and to see this subjective urge to return, the sites of return, and recover some of that deeply personal. I understand that this is a master political narratives, and particularly those that have been published, big publishers are investing in them. But I want to see whether it would be possible to go against the grain and recover parts that authors may have themselves actively suppressed. Does that make sense?
Yes, so I think, to reiterate the question, narratives that don't so much put the politics at the center of the return.
Yeah.
I think that would be I mean, it would be really excellent to have books that center less on the politics of Iran, and about this overwhelming feeling of the revolution, for example, during return. But I would say that the text that, and going back to Amy's question earlier, that I don't think I maybe addressed properly, there are not a lot of narratives of return, right? Because these tend to be the only trope. Return tends to be the only trope that complicates the idea that Iranians are always conscious of politics, that it's overwhelming, it overwhelmingly defines our identity. There's, of course, some truth to that, that Iranians perhaps don't have the privilege to not be political. But I think that it's the sacred again, that takes us away and makes it personal. That it is a way, and in the precise way that these writers do it, which is against the grain of the regime, saying this place is sacred to me. I'm thinking of, again, Parnos Furutan, who, when she returns to the Zoroastrian temple, which is, a very venerated site not only for Iranians, but also for a lot of the Western tourists that she encounters there while she's there. So she goes to a great ordeal to go back to Iran to get to this Zoroastrian temple where the eternal fire has been burning, but then she doesn't feel anything there. She doesn't feel anything there and says, I felt nothing. I don't know if I was supposed to feel something, but then later goes to, again, a tree nearby, where there she has this enlightenment, a sense of feeling at one with Iran, and through that old tree that she says will be standing for many generations and has been here, this old tree. So I think this also touches on the subjectivity of sacred sites, that it's a lot of times it's not the sites that are one is expected by the regime or the readers to have some sort of a breakthrough. But again, to answer the question, I think for me, anyways, I chose texts that I think that these texts are the ones that um, are not so explicitly perpetuating stereotypes, but unfortunately, I think mm, we readers tend to expect and therefore to read these texts, always looking for the political. And the earlier question about how many return narratives, there's also what I didn't include, Nazila Fatih's The Lonely War, which is it's a really well written return narrative. And what's interesting is she returns when she feels that that she feels that she might be followed and kind of feels endangered. So it always goes back to the question of what the nation represents, and going back, whether it's to make return, whether it's a prison narrative, it seems that the homeland is so sacred that uh, the returnee it's an act of sacrificial love, almost returning.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
We have another question, and before I get to that one, I can't help but follow up with what you've just described. Something that I've been thinking about is we had a follow-up question in the chat as well about fiction, and I'm wondering if you have any plan to kind of expand your gaze onto fictive returns. So that could be in fiction writing. I'm thinking of Adib Khorram's Dariush the Great is Not Okay, where there's this kind of return narrative for like a teenage boy, and it's a young adult novel, but it's very much an imagined return narrative, but also in film. So there's a lot of documentaries of this kind of return. Most recently, it was Junam, I think, a year or two ago. But there have been a lot over the years of kind of like bringing the camera on the return or imagining the return through the lens. So I'm wondering if that's something you've been thinking about also.
Very, very much, Amy John, and I'm also surprised that no question has come up yet about men's memoirs, because I think to fully understand what makes this subgenre a gendered subgenre is to also look at men's memoirs of return. Unfortunately, most of those right now, Maziar Bahari's, Jason Rezaian, they are prison memoirs. So Dariush, The Great is Not Okay is a really important text that I've been thinking about. And definitely, I think Iranian documentaries or diasporic documentaries and even shorts, um, exactly, return on the level of the imagination, I think, is something that I want to think more about, because going way back to, I think, a question that Persis had earlier about, or perhaps it was Gita, I'm sorry if I'm mistaking, but just the homecoming urge as the a very nationalistic urge. I think, especially with everything going on around us in the news, we can think about, we know the importance of moving beyond homecoming, of how homecoming, it can be very unethical um, in ways, and also maybe unachievable. But definitely, I think for both documentaries, fiction, but also memoirs written by men about returning. So what is the texture of it? What is their feeling and sensation also of being in Iran spaces? Um, Especially because it seems that the women's memoirs are so framed around the bodily experience there. That would be a really important cross analysis.
Okay, sorry, Sarah John, I had jumped in front of you. So Sarah Homozinejad had a question next.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I just wanted to confirm first if we still have time, then I would ask my question. But thank you so much, Dr. Keyzad. It was wonderful to listen to your talk. And I'm going to echo, I guess it was Abul Faz who said, I look forward to reading your dissertation, same, and also the book, hopefully in the future. And I think I'll be referencing you probably in my dissertation as well. So I'm also looking into Iranian migration from a sociological perspective. And I wanted to also ask you, and maybe also comment on the fact that so I'm also interviewing people who are returning, both return as an idea and as an act. So I'm looking at return from both of these kind of spaces, but interviewing people who have returned. And I'm doing this since 2018. So this is before Women, Life, Freedom, and after. Something that I have noticed is also that the lived experience of these people in the host countries are very much informing their decision and ideas about return. So it's not just about the homeland and the nostalgia. And it's interesting that some of these participants are actually telling me it's not nostalgic. Like I'm a first generation immigrant. I go back every other year to visit. I know how the situation is there. So it comes from a place of like, full knowledge about the presence of what's going on. It's not just a historical, just a revolution happened. I know what's happening right now, right? So, but the experiences that they have in the diaspora is really informing that sense of belonging. Is not just that I have that sense of belonging to Iran. And I'm also working on the notion of rite that you mentioned as roots in your work, but I'm keeping it actually as rite. I'm trying not to translate it because I feel like it can bring some cultural nuances, and people are using it in very different ways when I'm talking to them, which makes me think about, okay, so where is this, concept of roots or rite is coming from, and how is it developing, and why is it sometimes not finding roots, let's say here in the host society. So I just wanted to ask you, maybe, like, do you see also anything about the experiences abroad that is causing this desire to go back, this idealized, as you beautifully mentioned, or utopian past, and a hope for a future that has roots in the past? So yeah, I'm gonna stop there, but I really look forward into future conversations with you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and it's an honor that my talk would make you think about these topics, and I'm really happy you brought up the question of what inspires them other than nostalgia, because you're absolutely right, and I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to really touch on this, which is that like pilgrimage, like religious pilgrimage, all of the writers that in my project anyways, Asayir, Satrapi, and Forutan all return, not only what I said earlier because of having their papers and status, but all of them return after essentially crisis, at a moment of crisis. So, and like religious pilgrimage, a lot of religious pilgrims go on pilgrimage at a moment of crisis, when they need healing, when they need some something to happen, something to be resolved. So Asayesh, she returns when she gets her green card, but she's also experiencing sort of a moment of postpartum depression. She's kind of lost herself. She's quit her job. And it's really sort of the nothingness and silence that makes her have a moment where she remembers that she needs to go back. She actually has sort of the narrative begins with sort of an out-of-body experience that begins with her sense of boredom or lack of direction in America. Satrapi also returns after she hits rock bottom. She becomes homeless. She has her heart broken. She's sleeping on a park bench. And when the doctor says, like, I'm going to call your home, where is home? She says Iran. She also goes back in crisis. And Forutan also goes back after a crisis. She's graduated, but she feels that actually sort of what we might associate with the privileges of living in America, of being able to do whatever she wants, is making her feel nothing. She says, I feel nothing in America, where in Iran, I get to feel something. I get to express myself against all of the rules, which is so striking. So that is one major element, is that, and when you also look at more colloquially, a lot of, not just the Iranian diaspora, a lot of folks in the diaspora, exactly, I think you mentioned, I imagine the word defeat. I don't know if you said it, but there's a sense of hitting rock bottom and defeat and going back. But what makes a pilgrimage is that they always come back. And it's not and essentially it's the moment of realizing that you also can't repatriate, that you can't live here, and the idealized version of Iran, that veil is lifted most drastically with Forutan, who says, these same intersections, these same people now, I think she says something to the extent of now just seem to just display like the poverty that she used to romanticize and want to return to. The moment she decides to return, everything looks different.
Absolutely. Well, I think we're running out of time. I want to turn it back over to Dr. Tavakoli to close us out.
Thank you, Dr. Keyzad, for your wonderful presentation. Again, I look forward to the publication of the book. And thank you, Professor Malik, for moderating the session, and Professor Persis Karim for joining us in initiating this wonderful seminar series. We look forward to seeing you next month. And our speaker is going to be my distinguished colleague, Amy Malik.